Historical civil architecture and civilization development has been a particular fascination of mine. Not because I think stone is more important than story, but because stone remembers story in a way people often forget. A wall is never just a wall, it is a ledger of fear and trust, a compromise between climate and ambition, a handshake between geology and governance. When you stand before the bones of an old city, its arches, its drains, its roads that stubbornly refuse to be forgotten, you are not merely looking at ruins. You are looking at a theory of life made physical. You are looking at a civilization explaining itself without words. Early human civilizations naturally gravitated towards water. Even before we learnt to cross the open seas, people congregated around the shores, and they did so for reasons that are almost embarrassingly practical: drinking, fishing, washing, transport, fertile soil, and predictable patterns. Rivers and coasts were not romantic destinations. They were survival's most reliable teacher. Water is movement that can be harvested. It offers calories in fish and game, fertility in floodplains, and frictionless transport in a world where every kilogram carried over land was paid for with sweat, time, and risk. A river is a road that builds itself, and for early settlements that mattered more than any ideology. If you want to understand why the first cities rose where they did, it is rarely necessary to begin with kings and myths. Begin with the slope of the land, the rhythm of seasons, and the way water quietly organizes human possibility. From that starting point, civilization is not a sudden invention, but a slow thickening of complexity. Agriculture anchors people in place, but it is surplus that turns anchoring into architecture. The moment a community can store grain, dry fish, preserve food, when it can take tomorrow's hunger and push it into a granary, the future becomes negotiable. Surplus is time made edible. And once a society can consistently produce surplus, it can afford specialists: builders, scribes, smiths, priests, guards, merchants. It can afford coordination, and coordination demands symbols. That is where writing often enters. Not as poetry at first, but as accounting. Not as philosophy, but as logistics. The city becomes a machine for turning land and labor into organized life. Walls to protect storage, temples to sanctify authority, marketplaces to allocate goods, streets to move bodies, drains to manage waste. But water alone does not fully explain the inland bloom of towns and cities, and this is where maps teach humility. If you looked at inland towns and cities, they would appear pseudo-random, scattered like thrown seeds. Yet the pattern becomes much clearer when you overlay trade routes on the map. Inland settlements are rarely random. They are nodes, rest stops, choke points, river crossings, mountain passes, caravan junctions, places where movement is compelled to slow down, concentrate, and exchange. Traders and merchants did not simply wander, they traced the mathematics of terrain and security. They followed the easiest gradients, the safest corridors, the places where water could be found, animals could be fed, wheels could turn, and goods could change hands without the entire enterprise collapsing. Even the Silk Road, often spoken of as a single line, was really a braided network. Routes shifting with politics, climate, technology, and power, branching like roots around deserts and empires. Cities on these routes were not just built, they were selected by the logic of flow. And flow, in the end, is one of civilization's deepest secrets. Not ideas first, flow first. Flow of water, of grain, of labor, of information, of legitimacy. A settlement becomes a village when it survives. It becomes a town when it coordinates. It becomes a city when it intermediates flows larger than itself. This is why ports become power, why river confluences become wealth, why mountain passes become contested, why bridges become both infrastructure and vulnerability. A city is a threshold between farm and market, between inland and coast, between local life and long-distance exchange. It is not merely where people live, it is where roots collide. And when roots collide, something new appears. Prices, contracts, reputations, standards, coins, measurements, laws. Commerce does not just move goods, it standardizes reality. That is also where the human body quietly enters the picture, and where it becomes useful to ask the uncomfortable hypothetical questions we rarely ask. What if humans weren't bipedal? What if we moved like quadrupeds, or like something stranger, low to the ground, faster over short distances, but unable to carry objects efficiently with free hands? Would roads still be roads as we know them, Or would they be more like hardened trails optimized for hoof-like stride and gait stability? Would stairs even exist as a default architectural element, or would ramps and gradual gradients dominate our built world? What if our spines couldn't tolerate long periods upright, or our joints were built for sprinting rather than endurance? Would cities cluster more tightly with shorter commutes because the cost of moving bodies would be higher? The shape of our bones decides the shape of our streets more than we like to admit. Our civil architecture is formed around the foundation of logistical maneuvering. We build not only for beauty, but for movement of people, goods, animals, and later, vehicles. We have roads that separate houses and buildings not merely for aesthetic spacing, but because movement requires corridors. Corridors reduce friction. They prevent congestion. They allow emergency response. They create predictable pathways for trade. And in older cities, you can often see the fossil record of these logistics. Narrow medieval streets built for foot traffic and carts, broad imperial avenues built for troops and spectacle, industrial-era boulevards designed to accommodate new densities and flows. The street is not just empty space between structures. It is a deliberate carving out of possibility. Push the hypothetical further, and the entire emotional texture of civilization shifts. What if humans could not throw with accuracy? It sounds trivial until you remember how much early hunting, defense, and warfare relies on projectiles, and how much social organization can be accelerated by the ability to deter threats at a distance. Without accurate throwing, would communities have remained more cautious, more clustered, more defensive, built like burrows rather than open plans? Or consider the hand itself. What if we lacked fine motor control? Writing, weaving, tool-making, entire technologies would be delayed or replaced. Would civilization still lean toward dense cities, or would it remain more distributed because coordination tools would be weaker and specialization harder? Even our senses shape our cities. What if human hearing was dramatically more sensitive? Would loud marketplaces be unbearable, forcing trade to disperse into quieter, smaller nodes? Would cities develop deeper sound buffering, thicker walls, more courtyards, more separation between industry and residents, centuries earlier than they did? What if our night vision was excellent? Would streets be less reliant on lamps and openness, more labyrinthine, less fearful of darkness? Every physiological constraint becomes an architectural preference over time. And once preferences become norms, norms become the way cities are, and we forget that they were once merely adaptations to a specific kind of body. This is why the map's logic, water, routes, choke points, can't be separated from the anatomy of the creature doing the moving. The Silk Road is a network, yes, but it is also a network scaled to the endurance of legs, the needs of animals, the availability of fodder, and the speed at which a message can travel before it becomes irrelevant. A caravan's daily range is an architectural unit. It determines where rest stops become towns. The capacity of a cart determines the width and grade of a road. The turning radius of a wagon shapes intersections. Long before urban planning becomes a profession, urban planning is being done by physics, physiology, and the economics of effort. And once the logic of logistics is established, it begins to discipline the culture itself. A city teaches you how to behave because it teaches you how to move. Narrow alleys encourage slower pace and more encounters. Wide roads encourage speed, anonymity, and stratification. A market square creates public life. A highway bypass creates convenience but drains a town's heartbeat. Even zoning, whether explicit or implicit, is a way of sorting human life by movement patterns. Here you sleep, here you trade, here you worship, here you dump waste. The separation of houses from roads is not merely a design choice. It is an agreement about safety, privacy, noise, and the boundary between domestic life and public flow. Civilization is, in part, the ritualization of these boundaries. And so the earlier observation returns with more force. Inland cities are not random. They are legible once you understand what had to move, how far it could move, and what it cost to move it. But now we can add another layer. They are legible once you understand what kind of creature was doing the moving. Civilization is not just a story about land and water, kings and trade. It is also a story about hips and hands, gait and grip, lungs and endurance, perception and stress. Not only what we believed, but what we were capable of doing repeatedly, day after day, without collapsing. Which raises the final question that sits beneath all the others. How much of what we call civilization is truly a triumph of mind, and how much is simply the consequence of a particular body encountering a particular planet? If we had evolved differently, if we were faster but less dexterous, stronger but less social, more mobile but less able to store and build, would our cities look like ours at all? Or would civilization have taken an entirely different shape, one we would barely recognize as civilization? Perhaps the map we inherit is not only a map of history, but a map of constraints, revealing, quietly, that we built the world we live in because our bodies made some worlds possible and other worlds impossible.